So, funny thing, I was actually going to release an entirely different video this week to tie into the 2024 election. I'd already watched the film, done the recording, finished the edit, everything was done, ready to go. But then I realized, wait a minute, this year's election is on November 5th. It dawned on me, I was like, this is a perfect time to talk about V for Vendetta! I can't miss out on that! So, yeah, that video I originally did, it's on the back burner. Let me know if you want to see it at some point. I can just release it at a later date. But, yeah, we're going to be talking about V for Vendetta today. Hey everyone, I'm Ben, your underground conductor, and welcome to Underground Cinema. This week we'll be talking about the 2006 comic book adaptation V for Vendetta. Oh, funny thing, this is actually a Blockbuster copy, if you can see that right here. Previewed too. As mentioned, V for Vendetta is a comic book adaptation. It's adapted from a comic series of the same name, illustrated by David Lloyd and written by Alan Moore. Alan Moore, who, among many things, famously wrote Watchmen and The Killing Joke. Now, anyone who knows anything about Alan Moore would know that he famously despises every single adaptation of his work, which I understand. If you create a piece of art in a particular medium and then it's taken to another medium, the people who translate that work of art have to make substantive changes, and you as an individual may feel that your original vision was butchered. I completely understand that. A lot of artists feel that way. Like Stephen King, for instance, famously hates the Stanley Kubrick version of The Shining, despite the fact that it's an amazing film, which is why he eventually went off and made his own. It happens. That being said, though, V for Vendetta is amazing. Like, I cannot stress how good this movie is. It has issues, and there's things about it that I'd like to bring up politically regarding what it stands for, but it is definitely a great movie, and is an incredibly political movie. And something I'll definitely want to bring up later is how, even though this film takes place in England, a lot of the politics that it plays around with are not only applicable to America, but I would say are applicable to all democracies that exist across the entire world. But what is the plot of V for Vendetta? Well, we open up with a flashback to the year 1605. The film shows us a dramatized depiction of the failed gunpowder plot of November the 5th that was led by Guy Fawkes. Following the failure, we then see a depiction of Guy Fawkes being executed. Now, this execution sort of canonizes the figure of Guy Fawkes as a martyr to the cause of liberation. And that's not only true in the universe of this film, but it's also true in real life, as many people have adopted the Guy Fawkes iconography as a way to protest against tyranny around the world. Although, to be fair, the story of Guy Fawkes was popularized by V for Vendetta, not only the movie, but the comic. Anywho, we fast forward over 400 years later to a dystopian version of London. The year isn't necessarily clear, but it's somewhere in the late 2020s. We meet our main character, Eevee, played by Natalie Portman, as she's getting ready to go out for the night. While she's getting ready, the scene is juxtaposed by our other protagonist getting ready, the terrorist, or freedom fighter, depending on your point of view, known as V. The juxtaposition of these scenes is obviously meant to show the cosmic link that exists between these characters. There's a clear connection between V and Eevee even before they meet. Anyway, as Eevee goes out, she's walking around and she eventually gets stopped and harassed by fingermen, who in this universe are sort of like stand-ins for like the SS or the Stasi. The fingermen are about to have their way with her, but then V shows up and makes quick work of them. V then delivers probably the most alliterative monologue I've ever heard in my entire life. Here it is.
Voila! In view, a humble vaudevillian veteran, cast vicariously as both victim and villain by the vicissitudes of fate. This visage, no mere veneer of vanity, is a vestige of the vox populi, now vacant, vanished. However, this valorous visitation of a bygone vexation stands vivified, and has vowed to vanquish these venal and virulent vermin, vanguarding vice and vouchsafing the violently vicious and voracious violation of volition. The only verdict is vengeance, a vendetta, held as a votive not in vain, for the value and veracity of such shall one day vindicate the vigilant and the virtuous. Verily, this vichyssoise of verbiage veers most verbose, so let me simply add that it's my very good honor to meet you, and you may call me V.
Are you like a crazy person?
It's a lot. But Eevee becomes intrigued by V and follows him up to the top of a roof. At the top of a roof, we see a statue. As the clock strikes midnight, it is now November the 5th, and the statue explodes. Turns out V had set up that explosion as a statement for everyone to remember November 5th. Anyway, the next day, it's shown to us that the various members of the government are furious at this act, and that the Big Brother stand-in, High Chancellor Sutler, is demanding action. Sutler is actually, funny enough, played by John Hurt, who played Winston in 1984. It's incredibly ironic, and most likely intentional, that he went from playing Winston in 1984 to then becoming Big Brother. Sort of like how Robert De Niro started off as the stalker in King of Comedy and eventually became the talk show host in Joker. But Sutler is demanding action, so they get the propaganda machine rolling. The news begins to report on the explosion, and they say it's a demolition. But then V shows up, and he takes the entire news studio hostage. He then broadcasts a message to all the people of England saying, hey, everything's bad, right? You've noticed that, right? Well, there's people responsible for it, but ultimately it's all of your guys' fault for letting this happen. So, how about a year from now, on November the 5th, you come meet me at Parliament, and we're going to give the government a show that they'll never forget. V then attempts to make his escape after making his statement, but he's cornered by a policeman, and that's where Eevee shows up. Turns out, coincidentally, Eevee works at that news station. Eevee distracts the policeman long enough for V to knock him out, but Eevee gets knocked out in the process. V doesn't know what to do, so recognizing Eevee's loyalty to a complete stranger, V saves Eevee, and he takes Eevee back to his hideout. Now, this was ultimately a kind act for V to do, as he saved her from being sent to a black site. However, in taking her, V has made Eevee a target. And he says to her, listen, I'm sorry, I didn't know what to do, but you're going to have to stay here until probably November the 5th of next year. So she's essentially stuck with V for a year. She's angry about it at first, but then she settles in. And as time moves along, the two of them develop a very close relationship that seems borderline romantic, but also goes deeper than that. However, things change as V begins his personal plan. Throughout the year, V targets specific members of the Norse Fire Party to kill them. And we find out in the adjacent B plot that all the members that V is killing were part of like this human experiment that was going on right before this huge viral attack on England. Eevee obviously is off-put by the murder, so the first chance she gets, she betrays V's trust and runs away. She then goes to stay with her friend and former employer, Gordon Dietrich, and that's where she finds out that Dietrich himself actually isn't really a friend of the government either, finding out that he's not only gay, but also a collector of various contraband. Anyway, she feels pretty safe for a while. Dietrich is a very kind and supporting man, but then after a comedy segment that Dietrich set up, he ends up getting killed during a police raid, and Eevee gets taken to what she believes is a black site. While Eevee is imprisoned, she's tortured and psychologically manipulated, and all of it is just to see if she gives V up. And she doesn't. And it's an overtly hopeless situation that she's in. But despite the hopelessness, she never breaks. She may have betrayed V to get away from him, but she will not betray his safety. She's defiant to the very end, and completely ready to die. But in the moment where she believes that she's sentenced to death, she walks out of her cell and she realizes that the black site was fake. That V had set up this whole thing to see if Eevee would give him up, and to also see how strong Eevee really was. Which, yeah, that's to say that's toxic behavior is putting it lightly. He went too far. In any case, though, Eevee does feel liberated by the whole experience, and she ascends to the roof and screams into the rain as if she's being baptized as a new person. And the freedom she feels in that moment is juxtaposed with shots of V stepping out of the fire that gave birth to him. Once again, hammering home that connection between the two characters. Anyway, Eevee leaves V, and V continues his plan. Time continues to pass, and we eventually make it to November the 5th the following year. And at this point, enough discontent has spread amongst the populace of London that all the citizens march on Parliament to see if V makes good on his promise of fulfilling the original gunpowder plot. While this is happening, V has actually manipulated the party leader of Norsefire to essentially betray the High Chancellor of England, Chancellor Sutler. A government like this existing also illustrates the equivalent exchange law that exists within nature where every action has an equal and opposite reaction, and that reaction is V. If it wasn't for Norsefire's viral experiments, V, as he exists now, would have never come to be. So there is a sense of irony there that it is Norsefire's cruelty and sense of control that eventually led to their downfall. And what's even more ironic is that the fire that gave birth to the monster known as V was actually on November the 5th, just showing the subtle links and connections between everything. At the end of the film, we receive an amazing action sequence that's very reminiscent of The Matrix, which I will get into. But unfortunately, V is fatally wounded during this altercation, and only manages to barely make it back to his train bomb, and proceeds to die in Eevee's arms. Eevee, who is completely heartbroken, proceeds to fulfill V's dying wish, and send an entire cache load of explosives to blow up Parliament. As the film ends, we see this massive explosion of the government building as all these people in Guy Fawkes masks stand in front, witnessing the birth of a new London. And as the film wraps up, we see that many of them take off their masks, and we see the faces of all the people who have been killed by this corrupt government, signifying that they can finally rest in peace, that tyranny has ended. Now, V for Vendetta is a pretty spectacular film. Funny thing, the movie was actually supposed to be released in November of 2005 to actually coincide with the 400th anniversary of the failed gunpowder plot. Unfortunately, it was pushed back to March, but ultimately, either way, this film is absolutely spectacular, dealing with so many complex ideas of tyranny and authoritarianism and dystopian science fiction. It's funny, John Hurt himself, who plays Sutler in this, said that V for Vendetta was like a cross between 1984 and Alien, which is hilarious since he was in both. While other people attached to the project liken V for Vendetta to something like THX 1138 or Logan's Run. However, putting aside all the fantastical elements, this film to me feels very similar to The Lives of Others, which is a German film that came out actually 6 days after V for Vendetta. It takes place in the final years of East Germany in the Cold War. Absolutely astounding film about a Stasi agent who softens up and sort of develops this pseudo-friendship with an artist that he's been assigned to observe. Something of narrative relevance that I also want to bring up in this movie is that all the vestiges of the old world die prior to Parliament blowing up. Everyone who was involved in the viral experiments, they were killed by V. Sutler was killed by one of his stooges, Creedy. Creedy was killed by V, but V was also killed by Creedy's men. All of these key players that had some sort of hand in the last few decades of English politics have just been taken off the board. It's a clean slate, and it's up to the surviving members of the society to sort of rebuild everything from the ashes. Something I found funny is that they also reference in this film that America is an irradiated wasteland, which, let's hope that doesn't come true in the next few years. Moving on, though, I do find the creative forces behind this film interesting. Turns out V for Vendetta was written by the Wachowskis, who famously wrote and directed the Matrix trilogy. The original draft for V for Vendetta was actually written in the mid-90s before the Matrix movies were even made. I have no idea how many drafts they went through between the inception and this version, but I think this is probably the best possible version of this film we could have gotten. And funny enough, even though they didn't direct V for Vendetta, the film itself does have a lot of the same visual style, as well as the same philosophical themes that the Matrix trilogy has. And I attribute a lot of that to the director. V for Vendetta was actually the directorial debut of James McTeigue, and James McTeigue was a second unit director on the Matrix films. He actually knows the Wachowskis very well. They even gifted him a copy of the V for Vendetta comic book before they even started making the film. But yeah, as a directorial debut, he knocks it out of the park, conveying so many of these interesting political and philosophical ideas. But going into the ideas that this film presents, like I mentioned earlier, even though it takes place in England, there's so much of it that is applicable to democracies around the world. And in America specifically, you can see this film a lot as sort of a response to 9/11, primarily in the central philosophical conflict that the film covers. V for Vendetta really delves into this classic idea of liberty versus authority. What's more important, being secure or being free? In the post-9/11 world, that question was obviously floated around a lot, as new security measures were put in place to help protect people from terrorism. The 9/11 influences, I would say, don't even end there. Seeing how the news media is controlled by the government in this film is very evocative of how the mainstream media does a lot of the dirty work for the government even now. Like, there's a scene in this movie where the head of BTN, the news station in this film, says, "We're newsmen. Our job is to report the news. It's the government's job to fake it." That line is just very evident of, like, this sort of disgusting parasitic relationship that mainstream media has with the government. And obviously that's not a new thing. I mean, Noam Chomsky himself called this out 40 years ago in his book Manufacturing Consent, which I have a copy of that somewhere. I'm not gonna dig around for it. It's somewhere. I have it somewhere. There's also the accusations that sit behind V's speech to the people when he takes over the news stations. And he blames pretty much everyone in London for the uprising of Norsefire. Because in a functioning democracy, the only way tyranny can occur is if the individual citizens allow it to occur. But moving on to other clear 9/11 influences. It's mentioned in this film that owning a Quran is illegal. V says later on in the film that Gordon Dietrich was actually executed for owning a Quran in his house. And it's also mentioned later in this film that the viral attack that Norsefire had planned against its own country was originally blamed on religious extremists. And you look at that, and it could be pretty clearly seen as a metaphor for anthrax and Muslim terrorists. And while they never say what faith the extremists belong to, I think it's safe to say, considering all the other analogies in this film, that they were likely Muslim extremists, unfortunately. There's also a strong sense of bureaucracy in this sort of authoritarian nightmare that V for Vendetta exists in, which is to be expected. Any authoritarian government needs a strong sense of order. But there's times where it gets a little absurd. Like, something I found hilarious in the film is that while the investigator is on his investigation, he says that the most reliable records are tax records. Which, is true. I just found that immensely funny, but, him finding those tax records did eventually contribute to him discovering the sort of criminal background behind the current government. Which, speaking of that government, Norsefire, much like any other tyrannical government, they thrive on creating scapegoats. But it's extra insidious in this film because Norsefire appears to be a theocracy. Many of the high-ranking party members are members of the church. Chancellor Sutler himself is a very devoutly religious man, as we find out in the film. And the party slogan is strength through unity, unity through faith. Which is incredibly ironic considering that they blamed the biological attack on London on religious extremists. Because that's basically what they are, and they're the ones who did it. However, by showing that the tyrannical government in this film were the ones who were ultimately responsible for the attack, it kind of lends credence to, all of the, 9/11 inside job conspiracies that have been floating around for the past 20-some-odd years. Which kind of leads into, the political awkwardness near the finale of this film. So, V, who is our protagonist, is obviously an anarchist, and is often referred to as a terrorist, which is accurate. He's using violence in pursuit of political goals, which is the definition of terrorism. However, terrorism versus resistance, they're pretty much the same thing depending on your perspective. Ultimately, it's decided by who wins the altercation. And yes, it is true that V dies in the end in pursuit of his ultimate goal, but his goal is still accomplished. So I just find it incredibly interesting that this film sort of encourages its audience to rise up against its government if they find the government to be corrupt. Now, obviously, in this film in particular, the government is very much corrupt. It's a criminal government that attacked their own people. But if you were an individual living in this world and you had limited information to go off of, you could easily see the explosion of Parliament and the marching of thousands of people on Parliament as very similar to something like January 6th. Which, it's kind of awkward. Rewatching this film and seeing all the people marching on Parliament, I thought to myself, oh wow, that looks really familiar. And obviously that's not the film's fault, and I do think that this film ultimately does convey a timeless narrative of rising up against tyranny and authoritarianism, but it's something worth bringing up. The very fine line between rebellion and insurrection. Moving on from that, though, something more lighthearted that I wanted to bring up was sort of the odd similarities I noticed between the story of Valerie in this movie and the 1930 film Morocco. This film does feature a positively portrayed queer relationship in the form of Valerie and Ruth. Valerie in this film is a character who is deceased in the central narrative. We learn about her character when Natalie Portman is reading her biography in the fake cell that V made. I'll get to that in a second. We find out that Valerie was an actress, that her first big role was a movie called The Salt Flats that came out in this timeline's 2015, and that on the set of that film she met her partner Ruth. Now, when we first meet Ruth in this film, she's wearing a men's suit and a bowler hat, and the outfit is very evocative of Marlene Dietrich's outfit in Morocco. Not only that, but Morocco is actually the oldest known film to feature a lesbian kiss. And obviously the first thing that we see Ruth do is kiss another woman. So noticing all those similarities, and also considering the fact that the only other queer character in this film is a character named Gordon Dietrich, much like Marlene Dietrich from Morocco, it makes me wonder if the Wachowskis were intentionally trying to harken back to that old film. Because obviously, as many people may know, the Wachowskis are trans, both of them. And while it is true that this film came out before both of them transitioned, you can see a lot of the queer themes that the two of them played around with in films even as early as The Matrix, which would hint at where they would take their lives later. Just a little interesting detail that I wanted to bring up. It might be a complete coincidence, the fact that Ruth looks like Marlene Dietrich, and the fact that there's a character named Gordon Dietrich and the lesbian kiss. I'm just saying it's something I noticed. But let's go back for a second to what V did to Eevee in this film. He convinced her that she was trapped in a black site, tortured her to the verge of death, all to see how strong she was. And that's pretty nasty. Like, I like V as a character, I think he's incredibly interesting, but the fact that he was willing to do all that to a woman that he was in love with, and she felt the same, it just shows you not only how monstrous his character is, which is the point, because the government created a monster in him, but it also shows how possessed he's been by his own ideology, which is ultimately what this film's about. In the opening dramatization of Guy Fawkes' death, we hear a woman monologue about how you cannot hold an idea, how an idea cannot love, but men can. Men can love, but men can also die. The idea is what lives on. And V doesn't really see himself as a person anymore. He sees himself merely as a representative of these ideas and perspectives. And this obsession that he has with this one central goal of bringing freedom to England, while in a sense it's noble, it just really shows how short-sighted he is as an individual. And that short-sightedness is what eventually leads to his death in this film. His just thirst for vengeance and change and freedom. He's possessed by these ideas to a point where they not only hurt him, but they hurt the people around him. Like when Eevee finally gets out of that whole ordeal that he put her through, he's sort of praising her because now she is fearless like him. And that's not a good thing. That's a bad thing. You don't want to be like V. He's cool, but you don't want to be tortured like that. It's awful. And it's an awful thing that he did, and it's probably best that he's dead. Yeah. And yes, I do understand that Eevee did technically betray V earlier in this film, but, that wasn't an equivalent exchange. It just wasn't. Side note, though, this film is actually incredibly gorgeous. Like I said, I really like the visual style, but moving on to the cinematography itself, apparently this was the final film of cinematographer Adrian Brittle, who did the cinematography for The Mummy, Willow, The Princess Bride, and Aliens. The dude was a master at the craft of the camera, and while it is unfortunate that he died, I think he brought a wonderful visual flavor to what would be his final project. It's remarkable. But yeah, V for Vendetta, despite some questionable aspects of it, I think that this is overall an amazing film. It's a film that challenges its viewer to question the authority that exists in their life. V himself says it in this film, that people should not be afraid of their governments. Governments should be afraid of their people. And no matter what you believe in politically, I think it's important to remember that you as an individual, it is your job to keep the government in check. Now, I'm not going to turn this into a PSA telling you to vote. Trust me, there's enough of those floating around. Nor am I going to judge you for feeling too alienated by the political process in America to vote. I am friends with plenty of people who feel like whatever they do, things are just going to stay the same. And I completely understand that. But what I will say is that when things do get really bad, you as an individual do have the power to change it. And that isn't just in politics, but that's in your own life. If you're in a position where you feel like you have no control, if you're in a state where you feel like everything around you is just overwhelming and the world is just beating you down, just know that you are stronger than you think you are. And that no matter what, you can always improve things in your life. And that is something that you should never forget. So yeah, that was my review of V for Vendetta. I hope you all enjoyed it. Please feel free to subscribe if you're feeling generous. You can also follow me on Instagram or Letterboxd if you want to hear more of my film takes. And yeah, I will see you later. Remember, remember the 5th of November, the gunpowder treason and plot. I can think of no reason why the gunpowder treason should ever be forgot.